Before we go into the sessions, though, we have a guest. I would like to welcome Astrid Haas. She is with us today to give a talk on achieving the promises of cities that work. Welcome, Astrid.
Thank you.
She is an urban economist supporting cities across Africa to strengthen their financial systems, and she has a focus on unleashing new opportunities for subnational financing. And she has worked extensively with city governments in Africa and Asia and has taken on diverse roles. She's been an economist with the African Development Bank and a policy director at the International Growth Center. She was nominated by the University of Cape Town as one of Africa's young leaders in 2020, and she received a Johns Hopkins University's Outstanding Recent Graduate Award for her work on urbanization. So I would hand over the screen to you.
Thank you very much, Nadine, and thank you everyone for having me here. It's an honor not only to be starting a session, which obviously makes it both difficult and exciting because I get to sort of frame, but it's also an honor to be speaking at a session that brings together three really great universities that are focusing on urban management. And I think this thought of urban management across continents is really important. And particularly in my own continent, I'm speaking today from my own city, Kampala, Uganda. Urban scholarship is still quite new, and University of Lagos and Wits University are very much leading the fore here. And so we're very excited to see how this expands across Africa. Now I have to apologize. They're fixing the roof next door right outside my window right now. So in case there's some background noise, think of it as like the dense urban jungle with construction works going on and, the background that I chose. But I'm going to share my screen. The title of my lecture is Achieving the Promise of Cities That Work, but I'm going to speak to African cities primarily. This is where I work. Obviously, Africa is a very diverse continent, 54 countries, even more cities and growing cities. So, I won't even pretend to scratch the surface. But what I've done is I've read your incredibly interesting abstracts. And what I hope to do is be able to pull together the different themes that come through your different abstracts and your different research interests into showing why urbanization is arguably the most major opportunity for Africa to date, why Africa is struggling to unleash this opportunity at the moment. But then I would like to end with some case studies that bring sort of exciting prospects from across the continent about how we are managing to get it to work. Sorry, I'm just trying to see, can you see my screen? Is that working?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, great. So let me start with a basic introduction that you all obviously know because you're all urban scholars as to where the opportunity of cities lie. And the opportunity of cities really lie in what is at its heart, which is its people. People have been flocking to cities across history and across the globe to find opportunities for jobs, to find opportunities for better services, to find opportunities for their better generation. In fact, when you look at the economic data, it is moving to a city has proved in many cases to be the fastest route out of rural poverty to prosperity. And this can happen in the course of a single generation. At the same time, firms love to locate in cities, and this is what us economists like to think about. They like to go there because they have a big labor source, so they don't have to look for the different capacities. They'll have it all there and they can choose. They like to go there because they have their markets. And this is not markets just internal to the cities themselves, but if you think of most of the cities, obviously where you're located and where you come from, they are gateways to national, regional, and global markets, which in this day and age is very important. So they have places to sell their goods. They also have access to other firms, which is important both because they can source inputs there, but firms like to be located close to each other because it's a source of innovation as well. Perhaps the most stereotypical example of this is, of course, Silicon Valley and all the innovation that goes on there. But what's very important when it comes to African cities, they also like to locate there because there's relatively better public infrastructure. Now I'm saying this, and I should caveat, if I'm suddenly gone, that's probably because there's a power cut, but the power cuts here are better than the power cuts, for example, that you find in rural areas. And so they, most firms that want to operate at scale, they need the public infrastructure as well. So that's why firms like to locate in cities. And it's this density that brings people and firms together that has resulted in a very steady trend across history, where there's been an increased level, where we've seen an increased level of urbanization. It has also seen an increased level of growth. There's no single country in the world that has gone to achieve middle income status without having gone through an urbanization process. So obviously, this is a massive opportunity for the African continent, which is now the fastest urbanizing continent in the world. Some would argue even going through the fastest urban transition in history, rivaling that of China, which to date was the fastest, looking to add nearly 1 billion more people to our cities in the next 30 years. But, and in the next 30 years, 2/3 of cities on the continent are yet to be built. So 2/3 of the built environment is yet to come in the next 30 years. Obviously, the window of opportunity is very short, but the idea is that the opportunity is still open because still most of our urbanization process lies in front of us. Now, one thing I will note here is that most of my examples that I'll be giving today come from capital cities, but this is a misnomer because some of the fastest growing cities on the continent are the ones that don't actually exist yet, and some of the secondary cities. So actually, but there we don't have as much data yet, which is part of the challenge that we face. So even though most of the examples come from capital cities, I think the thinking needs to be broadened to think about intermediary cities, so secondary and tertiary cities as well. Now, one of the things that we know as economists is that correlation doesn't always equal causation. So not just because something is urbanizing doesn't necessarily mean that it leads to growth. And we definitely see that here in the African context. So whilst this trend has held very well in some of the most recent urbanizing regions around East Asia and the Pacific, you can see it's holding very nicely. Malaysia, sort of growth has taken off with urbanization. Indonesia, China, Thailand, Vietnam. As you can see, the pictures are much more messy when it comes to the African continent. And in fact, we see even for some countries, there's been an increase in urbanization related to a decline in economic growth. So it's actually not, this trend that we've seen is not holding true at the moment across Africa. Now, I should note that the ones where there's often a decline, those are often cities that have grown rapidly as the result of conflict. So aside from economic growth and productivity, cities often also provide relative peace and stability in conflict areas. And so you often see a lot of internal migration to cities, which is why, for example, on the graph on the right, you see Liberia has urbanized very quickly, but its GDP at the same time has gone down over between 1985 and 2010 over the scale. The other point that I think this graph makes is that it's not just any urbanization that's going to result in growth, is that we really need to manage urbanization and we really need to manage the urban process. These graphs are not saying that we should try and stop urbanization, and that up until recently has been a lot of the rhetoric, particularly at many national government levels and in many of the countries I work in, because they worry that the cities can't carry with the capacity. But people are going to continue moving to cities. This is going to happen. This is inevitable. So the question is how do we manage it to unleash that potential that has been unleashed in other places in the world? So now I'm going to go into the challenges part of my talk. This is the part that I'm often asked to talk on as well. Why are African cities challenging? And I think for all of you, I know that in living in South Africa or Nigeria or other parts of the continent, I don't need to tell you as part of the talk. You probably sit in the traffic, you probably see the slums, and you probably experience the pollution. You know what the downsides of density are. But I think it's important so that we understand where we need to focus our efforts in terms of unleashing the opportunity. And it's the opportunity that I want to end on and that I want the focus of this talk to be. But if you will allow me, I will just digress a little bit into where the challenges lie. So one is that the infrastructure And the reason firms want to locate in cities is just not being managed well, and the investments are not being made. This is from the recently disgraced World Bank Doing Business survey, but the one thing the Doing Business survey did is it provided us great data. So forgive me if I'm using this source, but I think I just want to illustrate two things with this. So these are two impediments, or these graphs represent two impediments. One is the regulatory impediment. For any of you who's undertaken any bureaucratic or administrative process in many of the countries that you come from, you know that this can be a massive headache. I am a taxpayer here in Uganda, and I have now taken 9 months to try and figure out how to pay my taxes, and yet my focus is on the tax system. So you can imagine how it is for other people to actually, and I want to pay my taxes. It's just an impossible thing to figure out. And this is the same thing for businesses, right? So here, the average time to start a business, which is the graph on the left, is substantially higher in sub-Saharan Africa. And if you were to probably plot that against cost, it's also a lot more costly than in the comparative graph here, which is the OECD high income countries. The other part is not only the regulatory environment, it's the infrastructure environment, which here is illustrated by the cost to obtain an electricity connection, which again, whilst the trend line is falling, is still again substantially higher in sub-Saharan Africa than it is in the OECD. And as I was alluding to before, if you have an electricity connection, it doesn't necessarily mean you actually then have permanent electricity, which, you know, again, many of us living in these cities very, very well know and very much experience on a frequent basis. So that just increases the costs of firms to do business, and means they don't really like to locate in these cities. So what happens when firms don't locate? Well, then they don't bring jobs. And I think this is highlighted very well. So I think between London, New York, Hong Kong, in the CBDs of the cities, they have between 120 to over 150,000 jobs per square kilometer. And I've used my own city, some work that was done by colleagues of mine. And in Kampala, in the peak, so where in the peak in Hong Kong, it's 151,600 jobs. In the peak in Kampala, it's about 22,000, just under 23,000 jobs. So you can see there's far fewer jobs. And in Kampala, that decreases rapidly with every kilometer you go out from the CBD. So there's a 32.4% reduction in like the number of employment opportunities. So what that means is if people can't find jobs, is that they have to create their own jobs, because they do have to survive in the city. And so you see a lot of single businesses and self-employed people. These are also pictures from my own city, but I think, you know, similar to many of the cities, you know, but a lot of men, for example, undertake boda driving. These are the motorcycle taxis. You see a lot of market sellers selling fruits and vegetables, but selling very much the same fruits and vegetables. Now, this is some statistics from Kampala. They did a census of the informal businesses, which make up over 60% of businesses in Kampala, perhaps even more, and generate nearly 80% of employment for people in the city. But these businesses are small. So 93% were operating below the poverty line. This is data from 2016. 70% of those were owned by women, showing sort of the gender impacts of this. Many of them are youth, reflecting the sort of youth population. And the interesting fact is that 24%, when asked whether they would like to do this, they said, actually, we would prefer a wage job, which is always an interesting statistics for me, because Kampala is often hailed as the source of entrepreneurship and employment, but it's entrepreneurship of survival and employment. And here I just want to also highlight one thing, and this reflects a little bit, I think, what Rory Sang's paper is going to look at, which is lockdown in the city, because in Uganda, we had some of the harshest lockdowns. We've been through 3 so far. But if in 2016, 93% of these businesses, micro enterprises, were operating close or below the poverty line, you can imagine what happens when a city locks down, is that many of those businesses were then pushed to the poverty line. And actually, we've seen the highest spikes in poverty due to lockdown in Kampala, but also incredibly high spikes in food insecurity, because a lot of the money that is generated through these micro enterprises is used to buy food in the city, affecting food security, which is, I know, another subject of another abstract in another paper. And on top of that, it's really expensive to live in African cities. In fact, relatively more expensive than cities like Berlin or like Dresden, which I think is another city that's going to be talked about, because these cities are sprawling outwards. These are two images of the growth of Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, where the outline shows the administrative city boundary, so where the city technically is, and the orange shows how far the settlements have moved outwards. And actually, when you think about the relative cost of living in a sub-Saharan African city compared to other cities in the world, for example, transport is 42% more expensive for people living in those cities because they're located so much further out with their housing than they are from where their jobs are located. Housing rent is up to 55% more expensive. So when you again see these recent polls that have come out from, I think the Economist did one about the most expensive cities to live in the world, and Paris, Hong Kong, Tel Aviv come out top. Actually, when you think about it relative to income, some of these cities are far more expensive for people, for the average urban residents to live in, which obviously affects livability. And this is the part that I look at, because one of the challenges with this is that if firms remain small, and in 2016, the average turnover, so I left this in pounds, but you probably can do, the average turnover of nearly 70% of these small businesses was below, let's say, $2,500, probably even lower now with the lockdown. It means the city doesn't really have tax base. Now, my own city, Kampala, has done great work in raising its revenues. In 2016, 2017, raising a peak of own source revenues. So these are just the revenues it collects. These are not the revenues it gets from central government, but just it collects. But for a city that has about 1.5 million people at night and about 4 million people during the day, own source revenue of $25 million is not very much to run a city on, particularly if you think about all the infrastructure investments that you have to make for it. So these budgets are very tight, and they remain tighter. But that's it with the challenges. Now let's look at the opportunities, and let's look at what those challenges mean in terms of where we place our focus. And again, I realize here I'm preaching to the choir, because again, many of your abstracts touch on this. So let me highlight some of the abstracts as I go through the opportunities, because I know that you will all talk about this much more, but let me just give you sort of a flavor and some opportunities and some examples from across the continent of where this has been done well. So, oops, sorry. So firstly, unlocking the potential for urbanization requires providing security of tenure. So people need to be safe that where they live and where they can work is not going to be bulldozed or taken away the next day. Now, a really impressive example of how this was done was in Rwanda, actually the whole country of Rwanda, which between 2009 and 2013 managed to register its whole land and its whole country through community participatory processes, and at an average cost per parcel of less than $6 a parcel. So now the whole of Rwanda is titled, and all of it is under freehold land system. And one of the outcomes of this, and it's the small graph on the bottom right, is that the number of mortgages registered increased because people were now much more willing to invest in their land. Now, there have been some challenges subsequently about keeping this system updated, but it is an example of how it can be done quickly and cost effectively. So in the period of 4 years, of 5 years, in fact, and through a community participatory mechanism, they were able to register our land. Now, I'm not advocating that freehold title is going to work everywhere, and Rwanda is obviously a very special case, but you will also hear from Nayora, who's going to be talking about collective land rights and urban tenure security. And you'll be hearing from Regina, who's going to be talking about an informal settlement here in Kampala, Kasikoso settlement. And Kampala, again, is an interesting case because we have four parallel land tenures. But in all of these tenure systems, the idea is how you provide security. Then a major opportunity that we have in our urbanization process, whilst it's late, we are urbanizing at a time where there's more data available than there has ever been before. So how do we harness that data to be able to make decisions? And here, the city of Cape Town is one that I wanna pick on, because the city of Cape Town actually has a data and a research strategy pertaining to the city. And where this became very evident and how it can be used was when the city of Cape Town was running out of water. And I think water is going to be, from an environmental perspective, one of the most important forthcoming challenges for cities of our time. And I think, David, you're going to be talking about water supply in Indonesia as well. So this is not only in African cities, but water is going to become a challenge in all cities. But Cape Town was nearing its day zero where it was going to run out of water. And so it collected data on a regular basis on household water consumption, but it also made it public. So everyone was able to look at this on their website. And this is just a screenshot from the website of some of water usage. And what this did was both allow people to understand where water usage was higher, and then also change their behaviors accordingly. It also provided the city the understanding of where it had to intervene. So this is just one example of how data and research can be used. But this is an opportunity that cities have, particularly where in resource scarce environments, being able to allocate those scarce resources effectively. Then a big challenge, as I mentioned, 2/3 of cities are yet to come. So how do we plan those cities and make investments in public infrastructure before people settle? And this is incredibly important because the cost of retrofitting, so the financial cost, and here there's evidence from Latin American cities that the financial cost of retrofitting can be up to 3 times more than actually doing it in advance. But then that's not to mention about the political, the administrative, and the social costs of moving people off their land to be able to put, for example, a water pipe once they've settled there. So being able to do this before people settle and direct investments accordingly is really, really important. And here are 2 examples. So one is an example of a city that I work in and that I really like, which is the city of Hargeisa in Somaliland. Now, this is a city with a full budget of $8 million. So it's not the richest city in the world by any means, but it's still managing to do this planning before settlement quite cheaply, as you can see here from the aerial photograph. So it's used its data to know which way the city is growing. And now it has put plots, demarcated these plots just with bulldozers to show people, like, keep these roads free for road arteries, for future road arteries, but also for public infrastructure work. So don't settle here. We're gonna build here, and this helps indicate to people where the infrastructure is coming. It also keeps the space free for infrastructure. Similar processes have been done in Colombia with using tree planting, and is being done now in Ethiopia as well. The other example here is from Tanzania, where actually in the 1970s and 80s, the World Bank had a sites and services program where they did a similar thing where they demarcated the plots, but the World Bank invested in the infrastructure. And for another part of the city, this is on the outskirts of Dar es Salaam, for another part of the outskirts, they just upgraded the infrastructure. And so now, 30 years later, we can look at the effects of this and actually being able to plan with public infrastructure and direct where people settle. The evidence shows that this land is actually 5 times more valuable than the land that was upgraded. So it also increased land value for the city, which, if there are land value capture instruments, can be used to invest then in more infrastructure. And then obviously it's that we ensure that we do this in the climate resilient, low carbon development form from the outset. In particular, considering the fact that, as I mentioned, retrofitting is up to 3 times more expensive. I think there's going to be some, Nora talking about densely populated places in Berlin and how you do a climate adaptation to that, which is significantly more difficult than if you do it from the outset. I think, Rebecca, you're also going to be talking about that for historic centers in Tegucigalpa and in Dresden. But if you can do it from the outset, it's cheaper, but obviously it's still very expensive. This was some economic modeling done by the Coalition for Urban Transitions, which said, if all cities could really plan for their climate resilient transition in advance by 2050, this is for Ethiopia and Kenya, how much it would cost, which are obviously multiple factors of their budget, but also how much it could generate in terms of benefits, which is significantly more. In particular, what I find very interesting is the net job creation. And then prioritizing housing as a central part of urban strategy. So housing is often, interestingly enough, not part of an urban strategy. It's usually part of a national strategy, yet its effects play out most in urban areas. And there's a number of housing papers that I know. I think Kamardeen, you're talking about mixed real estate use in Lagos. George, you're talking about, private sector investment in Lagos. Pitsi, you're talking about sustainable human settlements in South Africa. So all of these refer to similar things, but the idea is the cost of building housing is still extremely expensive in Africa. Now in Addis, they've tried a public housing program. But again, even with, I think they've built over 300,000 units right now, they can't keep up with the speed of urbanization. So I've actually just recently published a paper on like other sort of looking at incremental build and other methods like that. I'm happy to share it. But the idea, I think, from this slide is that housing needs to be centralized within an urban strategy, because that's really what provides livability and security for people. And then transport, which I think is the subject that a lot of you are interested in. And now, obviously, I'm using the Lagos BRT as an example and know that there's a lot of Lagosians on the call. So, probably you may disagree with me. But the thing about Lagos is that you have a BRT, and it's the first BRT in Africa. And so whilst it may not be perfect, it did a lot for in terms of increasing and public transport opportunities. And here are just some of the data about how it decreased transport costs, reduced times of travel, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, improved safety and comfort levels. And these are all papers that will be presented as well around mobility. I think there's Bamite, Kanya, Ralph, you all have papers on public transport in particular. And the other papers are focusing actually on safety and mobility overall. So having a mass public transportation system is both climate efficient, but also effective in being able to link people and to provide that connectivity from homes to jobs. And then finally, there's no papers on this, interestingly enough, at least from what I saw. So forgive me if I missed this, but this is my area of passion, which is how are we going to get the money? Because all of these things cost money, but part of it is also about a social contract, right? It's about being able to, once you raise those money in taxes, being able to spend them efficiently, effectively. And I showed you that graph of how sort of the own source revenue of Kampala has increased over the years. And this has been a particular campaign by the city to improve the social contract. So this is a picture from inside our city hall, which shows the sort of client services that are now provided. So treating the taxpayer as a client, as opposed to someone who's going to defraud the system. And then also making very clear from the communication, and this is on the right-hand panel, what it is that tax money is actually paying.
What is this?
So finally, all of that to say, sorry, finally, all of that to say just that this is a massive opportunity. We have about 20 to 30 years to unlock this opportunity. We have extremely relevant examples from across the African continent to show that, we can get the management of urban spaces right. We have the opportunity, as 2/3 of urban spaces are yet to be built. But most importantly, what we have is we have scholars and practitioners like you who are taking these challenges on head on, learning from other places and then bringing them back to your own cities. And that's actually the most exciting piece in this, that we are all going to be able to work together to be able to achieve this promise of cities that work. So I hope that gives you a very quick, broad overview of some of the challenges, but more importantly, the opportunities. Thank you very much for your time.
Great, thank you very much for that overview, Astrid.